Burke is the kind of person who, out of life's lemons, makes lemonade. To describe his personality in more detail, however, it must be mentioned that he uses up far too much vodka in the process. He is the author of a best-selling self-help book about the healing process, and in the opening scene, he arrives in Seattle to lead a week-long workshop. This city overwhelms him. After escaping traffic, rain catches up to him, and he is forced to enter his hotel drenched in water. Lane, his personal manager, meets him at the entrance. He is a little frustrated with Burke, but everything is perfectly arranged. The first seminar will be conducted soon, and the speaker has to prepare himself properly for this one. He changes into a smart suit, and to soothe his anxiety, he drinks some vodka before heading out. He seems extremely nervous before entering the workshop space, but his personality changes abruptly as his name is announced. Charismatic and energetic, he rushes inside the hall and meets his fans. As it seems, Burke's book as well as his workshop are about the process of overcoming grief. Being a talented motivational speaker, he speaks out of his experience and seizes the hearts of his audience. He takes some professional photos in the next scene. Being a little tense, he's asked if he wants to have a drink to loosen up, but he rejects it immediately. As it seems, his book mentions the problem of alcohol and endeavors to shed light on its terrible effects. A slight hypocrisy of Burke is shown here, as he explains to the photographer shortly after. The book was motivated by his wife's demise, intending to coach himself through grief. He wrote his first manuscript without even thinking about publishing it. While talking about it, he seems mildly troubled, but the photographer still continues to ask him further questions. Burke finds himself talking about how the tragic event happened. It seems to have been a car accident, a rainy day, a dog in the middle of the road, and one incorrect and fateful turn. The next morning, he leads his group into a traffic jam in front of the hotel and asks them to breathe in all the honking, screaming, and middle fingers. He takes them on top of a high building and asks them what they see. It is the same city, but seen from a different perspective. With this, he makes a thoughtful metaphor and clearly affects most of the participants. Before heading up into his room, however, he notices one of them, named Walter, trying to get a refund. He thinks that this workshop is not for him, and doesn't care at all what the refund policy is. He wants his money back. Overhearing his furious talk, Burke approaches the commotion and decides to speak to the man privately. Showing an incredible skill of empathy, he manages to learn that Walter's son passed, and that his sister talked him into coming here from very far away. Talking at a slow and low volume, Burke successfully makes him reconsider, and sets up a special bond with him in the process. One of the chapters of Burke's book mentions the importance of practicing happiness. Seeing his face in the next scene, however, assures us that he fails to carry out his second advice as well. After hours of being restless, he decides to leave his hotel room and, making a sharp corner, runs into a hotel florist. Her name is Alois, and confused, she moves away from him quickly. Burke looks around and notices a pen that she dropped. What he finds extremely puzzling, however, is the writing he finds behind a picture on the wall. The word is quidnunc, and as he soon learns from the dictionary, it means an overly inquisitive person. He drinks some tomato juice with Lane in the next scene, and maintains a terribly gloomy face, even though wonderful news is told to him. The manager is clearly doing his job perfectly. Burke is surely going to make a lot of money out of this, let alone become extremely famous. The writer understands this, but his heart doesn't embrace even the slightest glimpse of joy. Suddenly, he notices the florist girl again and, deciding to brush his gloom away, stands up and approaches her. After asking her out, he is taken aback by Alois's response. The girl starts talking in sign language, and since communication is impossible, she leaves the hotel. This was a lie on her part. The florist can speak perfect English. Following her the next morning, we appear at a guitar building workspace where her boyfriend works. His name is Tyler, and he seems to have forgotten to clean up after cheating on his girlfriend. Alois finds a glass of wine with lipstick on it and, enraged, breaks up with Tyler immediately. Her following working day is a little more difficult than usual. Meanwhile, Burke finds himself admiring the flowers in the halls of his hotel. Finishing up the process of signing his books in the next scene, a man comes up to him. Immediately Burke's expressions change, and he becomes overly anxious, struggling to make eye contact with him. The self-help guru stands in front of this man like a child who's been coughing and lying. He is called out on hypocrisy here, and he fails to fight back. Shortly after, while talking to Lane, he sheds light on the mystery. The man is his wife's father. The rest of Burke's day is as depressing as this last moment. As always, he takes the stairs to his hotel room instead of using an elevator, and watches a video of his wife, Cynthia. Meanwhile, Alois goes to her flower shop. Naturally, she is in a terrible mood after what happened with Tyler. Sharing this with Marty, her employee and her friend, she receives an overly long and harsh lecture about how she tends to choose guys that always end up hurting her in the end. Alois quiets Marty and tells her to get back to work. But the lecture seems to make her think about something she has never thought of before. In the next scene, Burke notices Alois talking to a hotel representative about flower arrangements. Since now, he thought that she was deaf, but here, he can clearly see her discussing something enthusiastically. His reaction is sudden and unexpected. After exploding, he comes up to her and scolds her for being such a liar. Her personality must be full of maggots and filth, since she finds it necessary to hide it with a colorful facade. Expressing all the anger, he dashes away towards the toilet and escapes the situation with no scar. Soon, however, something even more unpredictable happens. Clearly, Alois is in no mood to be scolded by a stranger, especially after being cheated on by yet another one of his kind. She appears in the toilet shortly after, and confronts him there harshly, as if she were cursing all the men she broke up with in place of Burke. She goes on, and only a poor man coming out of one of the cabins behind them is able to put an end to her monologue. During this speech, she touches on Burke's hypothetical wife far too many times, and their fight ends unresolved. Despite all of this, Alois receives an invitation to dinner that night. The letter is quite original, with a note saying "Quidnunc" on the back. Alois easily understands where it's from, and a smile appears on her face. In the next scene, she arrives at a fancy restaurant where Burke is waiting for her. The date goes as smoothly as one could imagine. Clearly, Burke isn't used to such occasions, and he struggles to have an interesting conversation. Unable to connect on a deeper level, the two say goodbye to one another with a handshake. Burke feels extremely down, restless and disappointed in himself. He runs after Alois and explains to her that he hasn't been on a date in the last 3 years, since his marriage ended. He doesn't specify why it ended, so the girl in front of him thinks that he's just divorced. Still, she sighs in relief, exclaiming that it explains why everything went the way it went back in the restaurant. Burke pauses before telling the truth about his wife. He doesn't want to lie, but saying the truth is too difficult for him. Alois' perspective on Burke has changed in this moment. She invites him to tag along as she goes over to her flower shop. They finally manage to have a real conversation then. When he's asked about his occupation, Burke prefers to remain mysterious and encourages her to just read his book. Alois, on the other hand, puts it simply, she always wanted to be a florist. She seems to not only enjoy, but also love her job deeply. Walking around the room, Burke even finds a set of duplicate letters that her customers write. Alois seems to hold them private, but she still shares some of them with Burke. In the next scene, the self-help guru takes a big step towards understanding his group members more closely. During the workshop, every participant should hold a candle of truth and be honest about their pain. When Walter's turn comes, he acts a bit reluctant, until he steps forward and tells everybody how his son passed. Sharing the trauma-related event, his face starts trembling. It is an extremely dark and sorrowful moment. Walter blames himself for what happened. He used to be a contractor, had his son at work with him when it happened. Now he can't even walk into a hardware store. His business is gone, and his wife has left him. After he is done sharing, Burke lets silence sink in, until he points out the importance of overcoming fear during the process of overcoming grief. To demonstrate how to fight against the crippling effects of fear, and to encourage his group, he offers them to participate in an interesting activity. The willing participants may walk on a burning coil. Alois walks by the hall and peeks inside, to see a group of people cheering each other on. It is a wonderful sight, until Walter steps forward to face the fear. He fails to take a leap here and falls back, saying that it won't do any good to him or his son. To convince him otherwise, Burke does something extremely unexpected. Alois frowns at the entrance as she sees him, stepping on a burning coal and waiting for Walter to join in. He shakes in pain, but endures it courageously. Compared to the pain he feels inside, this must feel like nothing. Despite his efforts, Walter still decides to walk away towards the entrance. Puzzled by this performance, Alois picks up Burke's book to read it thoroughly. In the next scene, Burke gets his feet painfully cured, and enters an important meeting that will define the course of his career. Professionals in marketing show him their plan for moving forward, and considering the degrading look of it all, Burke must not be impressed. The people in suits are clearly aiming at using people's wealth as a means to accumulate large amounts of wealth. Burke will be a quite effective tool in their hands. We don't get to hear the writer's answer, but it's clear that he doesn't think highly of this prospect. Going back up to his hotel room, he finds Alois's message in his voicemail, and the troubled thoughts temporarily evaporate from his mind. We see him in her car in the next scene. As we understand, she endeavors to drop in and out of her mother's house quickly, and she doesn't really want Burke to follow. For the sake of politeness, however, she still tells him that he is welcome to come in. Burke fails to read the situation correctly, so shortly after, he meets Alois's mom. The woman is clearly star-struck. Excited to see her daughter dating the famous Burke Ryan, she is over the moon from happiness, and shows him some pictures of her daughter's childhood. The farewell is warm and delightful. Alois's mood seems to be altered too, as she tells Burke to follow her lead. As it seems, the keys she got are to a large telephone truck with a chariot in the back. She seems to have quite a surprise up her sleeve. As the evening falls, the two arrive near a fence, and despite his reluctance, Burke is ushered into the chariot. He has a fear of elevators, so there's no wonder why he feels anxious. But this feeling of tension soon fades away as he sees what's behind the fence. It is a concert by Rogue Wave. Lake Michigan is playing, and a core memory is created. Afterwards, Alois tells him that she's halfway through his book. It means that she knows about his wife now. For a while, they talk about it, and Burke gets to share how meaningful his relationship with Cynthia was. To justify his past discretion, he says that it just didn't come up. Today's date is truly wonderful for both of them. This time, they won't say goodbye with only a handshake. It is clear that a strong bond is setting between them. And for Burke, who's been grieving his wife for 3 years, this relationship with Alois is an enormous step. He finds himself seeing her off with a wide smile stretched across his face. The next morning, Alois admits to Marty that she likes Burke a lot, but she also adds that she doesn't view this relationship as something serious in this moment. The expressions on her face reveal feelings that are contradictory to this statement. However, meanwhile, Burke decides to check out if there are more writings behind paintings in his hotel. Finally, he manages to find the word papismic behind one of the pictures, and learns that it means a sound that one makes while smacking one's lips. He sends Alois yet another message then, and instead of appearing at yet another important meeting, he goes to meet up with her and Marty at a local bar. Lane finds him in the next scene, and tries to talk him into leaving this place as quickly as possible. The manager is infuriated, and he won't calm down. Unable to understand why Burke is suddenly enjoying something, he reminds him that the CEO of a marketing company is coming in 2 days. He's Burke's close friend, however, so he quickly gets back to his senses and asks the writer if he wants to continue with the process. If, for some reason, Burke wants to fall back, Lane will be okay with it. As he learns to his satisfaction, he won't have to terminate the process. Burke promises that he will act responsibly after today. After the matter is closed, Lane gets interested in his company, and for a while they speak about Alois. Speak is actually an over-exaggeration. Burke fails to say anything verbally, but his eyes can tell what's going on inside his mind. Lane is extremely happy for his friend. He decides to join them in having fun. That night, while walking in a graveyard, a brief argument breaks out within the group. Marty says that she doesn't understand the meaning behind funerals. She views it as something completely unnecessary, and the self-acclaimed expert in grieving decides to fight back. He brings an example of his wife's funeral, saying that it had almost a magic, healing quality to it. It was early spring, and dahlias were blooming. This last information particularly stands out to Alois. She knows everything about flowers, and she knows that dahlias don't bloom in spring. She walks up to Burke and points it out. She understands now that Burke is lying. This story is a facade he wants to give in social situations. Burke walks away without saying anything. It is Lane who breaks it to Alois that after his wife passed, Burke didn't even attend her funeral. Later that night, we see him ascending stairs to the highest building in Seattle. Seeing his wife vividly in front of him, the trauma memory comes back to him in full force. It feels as if the pain will always be a major part of his life. The next morning, during a group therapy session he conducts, he becomes overly frustrated with Walter, who seems to be still struggling with pain. Burke seems to begin projecting his anger and anxiety onto the group members, and receives nothing but the same emotions in return. After all, they are back to their senses. Burke attempts to get back to the leading position, and kneels in front of Walter. He listens to his struggles, and since the pain of loss is so familiar to him, he manages to understand Walter on the deepest level. Once he experiences his customer's pain and confusion, suddenly he sees a way out of it and offers it to Walter. The man is a contractor, and to get his life back, he must do what he knows best: rebuild it from scratch. In the next scene, he takes the entire group to a large hardware store. Entering the facility is extremely difficult for Walter, but with the encouragement of Burke and the company, he manages to face his trauma step by step. The shopping cart is filled then, and the man suddenly finds himself feeling a glimpse of life in his heart. To thank Burke for reminding him what it feels like to be alive, he gifts him a picture of his kid. He seems to be taking his eyes off the rear-view mirror and walking away, with no intention of looking back. Burke is left alone in the hardware store now. He wants to feel the same way. Later that day, he decides to face the truth himself. While visiting Alois in her shop, he takes off the mask he's been wearing and tells her the truth about his grief. Maintaining a warm and caring attitude, Alois tells him about her perspective. It seems to her that Burke needs someone who will guide him through overcoming his fears. It's clear to her where he must start. Cynthia made Burke promise once that if something happened to her, he would take her parrot, named Rocky, and release it into the wilderness. Obviously, her husband failed to fulfill her wish. Now, taking this step feels impossible to Burke, since he knows that in order to retrieve the bird, he will also have to face Cynthia's parents. But thankfully, he has a person by his side who will guide him through this process, giving him this necessary nudge. Alois takes him to his father-in-law's house in the next scene, and watches him as he struggles to get out of the vehicle. Finally, Burke manages to do it. With a racing heart and hastened breathing, he approaches the door and does something he won't be proud of later. Instead of ringing a bell, he goes around the house to determine where they keep Rocky before sneaking inside. Taking his cage from the ceiling proves to be an awfully difficult thing to do. In the end, after a lot of struggling and hiding, he manages to take the bird outside and runs toward Alois' car, as if he were concluding a bank robbery. Panicked by the commotion, Alois drives away as quickly as possible, but after learning that Burke failed to face his in-laws, she slams the brakes. She tries to convince him to get back there and talk to them, but after realizing that Burke won't do it, she lets him get away with it for now. Burke makes his way into the wilderness in the next scene. Finding a perfect spot on the bank of a river, he opens the cage door and watches as Rocky steps outside. The bird doesn't want to go anywhere. Happy that his old owner is back, he hops along the bank and seems to be in a great mood. The same cannot be said of Burke, of course. His frustration grows, and the moment becomes increasingly heavy and emotional, until he decides to just turn around and leave, concluding that he won't get to see the bird fly away freely. Pacing back to Alois, he suddenly hears Rocky's voice and runs back to him. This is when the bird decides to finally spread his wings and show his original owner how one should turn his back on a cage. Returning to Alois, Burke doesn't want to talk about the experience. He wants to be fine, and the questions that Alois shoots in his direction force him to talk about the feeling he wants to repress. This is why he suddenly becomes angry and snaps at her, saying that he won't be psychoanalyzed. In this heated moment, he decides to return to his hotel on his own. When he finally arrives there, it is already night. Lane is extremely annoyed by him, so he immediately gets in his face to scold him for being late. Seeing that his friend is in no mood to discuss business matters, however, he takes off the mask of a demanding manager and tells him that he's here if he wants to talk about anything. Burke is furious with himself. He shares with Lane that he screwed everything up with Alois. He's disappointed in himself, but more importantly, he seems to have lost all hope for a better tomorrow. Lane wants to talk to him, but he won't get a chance to help his friend tonight. The next morning he meets with Alois, and coming back to the hotel, he leads Burke into a conference room where she's waiting for him. Burke is quiet for a moment, impressed by Lane's ability to outplay him. He puzzles over what to say then, and comes up with nothing better than an apology for how he behaved yesterday. Alois has much more important things to say, though. She came here to express to Burke that he doesn't deserve what he puts himself through. She hopes to see the day when he finds a way out of this dreadful existence. She has no keys to help him out, no exact pointers to provide him with. But her words contain so much warm concern that she manages to put a seed of motivation in Burke's heart. Before the last seminar begins, Lane announces that Burke Ryan's TV show will soon air on national television. Burke is as anxious as ever before walking in. He has the whole speech prepared, and he knows exactly what kind of attitude he should maintain throughout the whole process. But as he appears on stage, anxiety keeps standing in his way. After a few seconds, words are scattered in his mind, and he is forced to take a few deep breaths before continuing. Meanwhile, one more participant enters the hall. It's Burke's father-in-law, infuriated that the bird was stolen from him. It's clear that he's here to seek a quarrel, but seeing his son-in-law in this confused, anxious state makes him pause. Burke finally decides to tell his audience the truth in this moment. He's not nearly as courageous as he's been urging them to be. The full truth is far more tragic than this. However, tears come rushing from Burke's face as he admits for the first time that he is at fault for his wife's demise. On that fateful day, they'd been arguing over a paint color for their kitchen, and he was the one behind the wheel. Burke remembers how a dog appeared on the road, and how one mistake from his side ended in his wife's passing. In guilt and desperation, Burke breaks down on the stage, until he hears the voice of his father-in-law telling him that it is not his fault. The man steps up on the stage with him, and tries to assure him warmly that it was only an unavoidable accident. They never blamed him for Cynthia's loss. They only wanted to mourn together with him. This bittersweet, emotionally loaded episode ends with a firm, accepting embrace and loud applause in the audience. Once the seminar is over, Burke meets with the CEO of the marketing company, receives a handshake of respect from him, and moves over to where his father-in-law is waiting for him. Now, once the tears are left behind, Burke is encouraged to get on with his life and not get estranged from his in-laws. Their goodbye is cheerful and full of hope. Smiling, Burke faces his fear of elevators and packs up to leave the hotel. It is obvious what his next destination will be. In the next scene, Eloise finds a note on her display window. It says, sesquipedalienist, which means a person who uses long, unusual, sometimes obscene words in speech or writing. After checking the dictionary, she chuckles, says hi to Marty, and turns back to see Burke entering the shop. His face is brighter than ever, with no facade blocking his true self. He asks to be given another chance. The part of him that used to be hidden in shadows is now available, and he wants to know if Eloise is up to meeting him. Fortunately, the answer is yes.